Carl Jung's most unsettling discovery was never really about healing from trauma. It was about what happens to empaths after surviving narcissistic abuse. He believed that this final stage of transformation was either the point of total psychological collapse or the spark of something the human mind had rarely, if ever, seen before. In his practice, Jung began noticing something strange in empaths who had endured relentless, narcissistic manipulation. Some of them didn't just recover. They didn't simply rebuild their old lives. They underwent a complete metamorphosis. Jung called it the birth of integrated shadow consciousness, a state in which they were no longer vulnerable to emotional predators of any kind. But this discovery unsettled him deeply. These people were no longer recognizable to those who had known them before. He described them as possessing sovereign empathy, the power to feel deeply without being destroyed by it. They could still sense pain, still connect, but they became psychologically untouchable. Jung admitted he had rarely encountered such a level of consciousness. And he warned that the journey to get there was so brutal, it either annihilated empathy altogether or gave rise to something that transcended the very idea of victim or survivor. One of his most famous cases started in 1928. A patient he referred to only as M, a 34-year-old woman, came to him shattered. Years of relationships with narcissistic partners had dissolved her sense of self so completely that she couldn't tell where her emotions ended and another person's began. Jung described her as psychically dissolved, but what happened over the next 2 years defied his expectations. M didn't just heal. She transformed. Through what Jung called shadow integration, she developed a kind of conscious permeability. She could choose what to absorb and what to deflect. Jung wrote, "M has achieved something I previously thought impossible: complete empathic sovereignty. She can feel the depths of another's pain without drowning in it. She can detect deception with almost supernatural clarity. And most remarkably, she is immune to manipulation, yet still capable of compassion." The shift was so radical that even her family barely recognized her. Once the emotional caretaker, she now held unshakable boundaries. Friends accused her of turning cold, but Jung saw something far deeper. He said her eyes had changed, as if she has gazed into the abyss of human nature and emerged not broken, but wise. This, he realized, was the paradox of narcissistic abuse. It creates what he called the empathic crucible, a pressure so intense that it either destroys empathy or forges it into something more refined and powerful. At the heart of this transformation lies shadow integration. Jung explained that narcissists act as unconscious mirrors of the empath's own disowned traits: manipulation, selfishness, detachment. To survive, the empath is forced into brutal confrontation with their own shadow. Jung noted 3 symbolic deaths in this process: the death of their self-image as purely good, the death of their belief that love can save everyone, and the death of their need for outside validation to feel worthy. Only by enduring these deaths can the empath integrate their shadow and move into sovereignty. Those who make it through don't become numb. They gain mastery. Jung called it integrated empathy, the ability to feel without fixing, to understand without carrying responsibility, to love without losing themselves. He observed that, neurologically, they retained sensitivity, but acquired a new filtering system. They could sense everything, yet decide what to let in. It mirrored the discipline of advanced meditators. but born out of trauma, not spiritual practice. But there was a cost. Jung admitted what disturbed him most was that many of these transformed empaths grew isolated, not because they wanted solitude, but because their new way of being was fundamentally incompatible with those still trapped in unconscious patterns. They could sense projection, ego games, and hidden manipulation instantly. And once you've seen that clearly, it's almost impossible to unsee. Jung's dangerous discovery was this: narcissistic abuse doesn't just break people. For a rare few, it forges them into something extraordinary. Beings who embody empathy without vulnerability, compassion without exploitation. Yet in gaining this power, they often lose the comfort of belonging to the world as it once was. Carl Jung uncovered something he considered not just groundbreaking, but dangerous. It wasn't simply about healing after trauma. It was about what happens when an empath survives narcissistic abuse and evolves past anything most of us can comprehend. He saw it in his patients, a gap he called the consciousness divide. Those who had integrated their shadow could no longer connect in the same way with people who hadn't. One patient told him, "It's like I can see the machinery inside everyone. Their defenses, their projections, their hidden motives. It's all transparent now. But the clarity has cost me nearly every relationship I had." This was the hidden danger of empathic evolution. Jung realized these people had developed what he named archetypal sight, the ability to see beneath masks, beyond personas, into the very psychological patterns running human behavior. It made them extraordinary healers and guides, but it also stripped them of the innocence required for ordinary social life. Jung compared it to the biblical story. They have eaten from the tree of psychological knowledge, and like Adam and Eve, they can never return to the garden of unconscious innocence. And perhaps most disturbing of all, other people instinctively sensed it. Friends, family, even fellow therapists would recoil. Not because the evolved empath was wrong, but because they saw too clearly. Jung called this the prophet's isolation. Rejected not for error, but for sight. Through decades of casework, Jung mapped 4 pathways empaths tend to take after narcissistic abuse. Only one leads to what he considered the final stage of development. Type 1, the dissolved empath. These are the ones who never find their way back. Their sense of self is permanently blurred, lost in a flood of other people's feelings. Jung said they become like psychic ghosts, alive, but not truly living. They often cycle through abuse again and again, trapped in what he called perpetual victim consciousness. Type 2, the armored empath. This type responds by shutting it all down. They build walls so high around their hearts that no one can reach them. Jung described them as safe, but disconnected, choosing protection over authenticity. They avoid further harm, but at the price of losing their gift. Type 3, the wounded healer. These empaths turn their pain into purpose, devoting themselves to helping others. Noble, yes. But Jung warned that many fall into compulsive rescue patterns. They're still vulnerable because their self-worth hinges on being needed. He noted they had boundaries, but not sovereignty. Type 4, the sovereign empath. This was the stage Jung believed marked an evolutionary leap in human consciousness. Sovereign empaths integrate their light and their shadow, becoming what he called conscious vessels. They can hold the full spectrum of human experience without drowning in it. Jung described their qualities with awe. They feel others' emotions without taking responsibility for them. They detect manipulation instantly, yet answer with compassion instead of rage. They hold boundaries without building walls. They embody what Jung called archetypal wisdom, seeing human behavior at its deepest root. The difference? They have embraced their own shadow fully, because they no longer disown their darkness. Narcissists and manipulators can't hook them anymore. And yet, Jung confessed that this evolution carried its own dangers. Sovereign empaths often live in profound isolation. He wrote, "They have outgrown the psychological level of most humans. Like adults trying to relate to children, the gap in consciousness becomes unbridgeable." Many described themselves as aliens in their own families. They also bore what Jung called the burden of sight. They could no longer unsee the unconscious patterns driving the world, predicting relationship breakdowns, spotting political games, and sensing emotional dynamics years before they unfolded. With this came the weight of responsibility. They often knew the solutions to people's struggles, but understood that truth offered without invitation is rarely welcomed. Jung named this the Cassandra complex. Accurate insight met with rejection. Perhaps most difficult of all was the demand for authenticity. Sovereign empaths became living truth detectors. They could feel falseness immediately, within others and within themselves. That made ordinary socializing nearly impossible. Jung wrote, "They have achieved psychological mastery, but at the cost of normal human connection. They have become bridges between the conscious and unconscious. But bridges are walked upon, not embraced." And the final danger, he noted, was what he called archetypal possession. When the power of this evolution overwhelmed the individual, consuming them entirely. Jung's conclusion was haunting. To reach the final stage of empathic development is to hold both liberation and exile in the same hand. It is a kind of greatness, but it comes with a cost few would willingly pay. Some empaths became so consumed by their role as healers and truth-tellers that they began to lose touch with their own humanity. Jung saw this again and again in his work, and it led him to create what he called the shadow integration protocol. It wasn't therapy in the conventional sense. It was something far more radical. Jung described it as psychological alchemy, turning the lead of trauma into the gold of wisdom. Stage 1, shadow acknowledgement. The first step, Jung insisted, was brutally honest. Empaths had to face their own capacity for selfishness, manipulation, even cruelty. "You cannot integrate what you refuse to own," he wrote. This meant recognizing that even their gifts could be used to control, that even their victimhood could be wielded as a weapon, that being good might have been a mask for deeper needs they were too afraid to admit. Stage 2, projection withdrawal. The next stage was about pulling back projections from the narcissist. Jung taught empaths to see that the narcissist's grandiosity reflected their own buried hunger for recognition, that the manipulative games they endured echoed their own subtle controlling impulses, and that the narcissist's numbness revealed the empath's hidden disconnection from their own feelings. Stage 3, boundary alchemy. Instead of walls, Jung emphasized what he called conscious permeability, a flexible boundary system, the ability to choose moment by moment what to let in and what to deflect. This was empathic discernment, feeling without fixing, understanding without rescuing, loving without losing yourself. Stage 4, archetypal alignment. Finally, Jung believed the empath must align with what he called the wounded healer archetype. This wasn't about becoming a therapist or savior. It was about embodying a union of wisdom and compassion, carrying suffering not as a curse, but as initiation into a deeper role within the human collective. To support these stages, Jung designed specific practices, shadow dialogues, conscious conversations with rejected parts of the self, empathic fasting, deliberately choosing times of emotional non-absorption, and archetypal meditation, tuning into the deeper patterns shaping human behavior. The most vital truth Jung emphasized was this: empaths must stop trying to return to who they were before the abuse. The chrysalis cannot become a caterpillar again, he wrote. The goal is not recovery, but metamorphosis. Jung even admitted that his own theories were born from this very process. In his private notes, he confessed that he himself endured what he called psychological persecution from authority figures who tried to exploit his sensitivity. My tormentors unknowingly became my greatest teachers, he wrote. Rather than growing bitter, he studied them like living case studies and transformed that pain into insights that became his life's work. He saw similar success patterns in others. A composer who survived an abusive marriage and poured her wounds into music that resonated at the level of myth. A physician who, after enduring manipulation from colleagues, developed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose patients. What bound them together was perspective. They refused to see their trauma as random cruelty. Instead, they saw it as initiation. But Jung also studied the failures. The gifted empaths who didn't integrate. Some clung to victimhood, making their trauma their entire identity. Others turned dark, using their psychological insights to manipulate. The wounded wounders, as Jung called them. The difference between destruction and transcendence, he concluded, was simple: the willingness to transform poison into medicine. Refusal to face the shadow always led to collapse. Jung also recognized that sovereign empaths could not thrive in typical relationships. They needed something else. What he named consciousness compatibility. He developed ways to help them recognize one another. Signals included being able to talk psychology without defensiveness, comfort with contradiction and paradox, a lack of superiority, and what Jung called archetypal humor. The rare ability to laugh at the darkest truths. As for safe relationships, Jung observed they shared the same traits: mutual respect for boundaries, ease in silence without the pressure to fill it, openness about shadow without judgment, and what he called conscious intimacy. Connection grounded in authenticity instead of projection. In the end, Jung's vision was clear. Sovereign empathy wasn't about returning to innocence. It was about carrying the scars of abuse as a crown, proof of transformation. Not recovery, but metamorphosis. Not victimhood, but evolution. Carl Jung once suggested that those who endure life-altering pain are not meant to walk alone. He urged empaths who had undergone deep transformation to seek out kindred spirits. Not just fellow survivors of narcissistic abuse, but anyone who had faced an initiation through suffering. Trauma survivors, spiritual seekers, those who had stumbled into their shadow and survived major upheavals. These were the companions who could truly understand. Together, they create communities where pain becomes wisdom and isolation becomes connection. Jung also gave a solemn warning. Do not cling to relationships with people who remain unconscious, simply because guilt whispers that you should. A butterfly cannot shrink itself back into the skin of a caterpillar. To pretend otherwise, he wrote, is to betray your own transformation. Instead, he encouraged empaths to step into what he called archetypal service, to use their hard-won gifts of empathy, teaching, healing, creating, or simply embodying integrated consciousness for the sake of the collective. The 5 metamorphoses. Jung described the evolution from wounded empath to sovereign empath as a passage through 5 metamorphoses, each carrying its own trials. Metamorphosis. 1. Dissolution. This begins in the thick of abuse, when the empath's sense of self shatters. It feels like death itself. Yet, Jung insisted, it is not death, but ego dissolution. The destruction of illusions and false identities. He called it blessed disintegration, a sacred collapse making way for rebirth. Metamorphosis 2. The descent. After abuse, the empath steps into the underworld. Here, the shadows are unavoidable. They must confront their role in the dynamic, their deepest fears about worth, and the terror that maybe they are unlovable. It looks like depression, but Jung reframed it as psychological composting. The breakdown that nurtures new growth. Metamorphosis 3. Integration. The empath begins choosing consciously what to embrace, what to release, and what to transform. Jung named it selective shadow incorporation. Anger is felt without cruelty. Power is claimed without manipulation. Even selfishness is acknowledged without slipping into narcissism. In this stage, wholeness is born. Metamorphosis 4. Emergence. Now the empath's abilities return, but purified. They still feel the emotions of others, but without compulsion to fix them. They recognize manipulation without needing to attack it. They can love deeply without losing themselves. Compassion flows without self-erasure. Metamorphosis. 5. Sovereignty. This is the culmination, the flowering of archetypal consciousness. The sovereign empath sees not only individual psychology, but the vast patterns that govern human behavior. They become bridges between the personal and the universal, guiding others across unseen terrain. Jung estimated that each metamorphosis could last 6 to 18 months, with the full process spanning 3 to 7 years. But the timeline depends less on clocks and more on courage. The willingness to face the shadow and embrace integration rather than chasing quick fixes. The traps along the way. Jung warned of traps that threatened to derail the empath's journey. The spiritual superiority trap. Some, glimpsing their new abilities, mistake them for proof of enlightenment. They imagine themselves above others. But sovereignty is rooted in humility. Jung wrote, "The moment one believes they are beyond shadow, they are possessed by it." The perpetual healing trap. Here the empath becomes addicted to self-improvement, constantly consuming new therapies, but never embodying their lessons. Jung called it therapeutic materialism. The isolation trap. While solitude is necessary, permanent withdrawal from others is not sovereignty, but avoidance. True evolution requires engagement with the world. The revenge trap. The most tempting. Empaths may use their insights to subtly punish or manipulate those who once hurt them. Yet Jung urged that true integration transforms revenge into compassion. For the unconscious, for the wounded, for those still lost in shadow. To stay steady, Jung advised daily shadow check-ins, moments of honest self-examination about one's motives, projections, and emotional responses. These small practices keep the empath anchored in consciousness. A leap in human evolution. Perhaps Jung's most daring insight was this: sovereign empaths are not merely individuals who healed. They are an evolutionary step forward for humanity itself. They embody the capacity to feel the full spectrum of human emotion without losing their center. They stand as bridges between ego and soul, between the personal story and the universal myth. In a world thick with collective trauma, sovereign empaths serve as midwives for consciousness. Their suffering, Jung wrote, was never just personal. It was archetypal. They carry wounds for the species, and in their transformation lies medicine the world desperately needs. The empath who survives narcissistic abuse and reaches sovereignty undergoes the ultimate individuation, becoming fully themselves while serving something infinitely larger. Jung's most unsettling revelation was that our deepest wounds, once integrated, become our greatest gifts. The sovereign empath stands as living proof. Catastrophe can seed consciousness. Wisdom can be forged in fire. What was meant to destroy us may in truth be the very crucible that makes us whole. In his final reflections, Jung even called the narcissist an unwilling priest of initiation. Through cruelty, they force the empath into transformation, giving birth to the very consciousness that may one day heal what the narcissist represents. Your suffering, if you allow it, is not meaningless. It is initiation. Your transformation is not just for you, but for all of us. So if you feel yourself somewhere on this path, dare to speak it. I am becoming sovereign. Let your journey become not only your healing, but humanity's evolution.